So at this point, we've been looking at how to massage the story that we tell to try and come up with a scenario that supports a more practical, real world torture policy, but that still generates the intuition that it's morally good. And so, where are we in that project? Well, let's see how it looks here. Suppose we rephrase our modified ticking bomb case using what's is somewhat more probable, but still pretty optimistic numbers, really. So, once in a while, we actually catch a terrorist who has information that will save the lives of thousands of people. Now, that might be through directly giving evidence to stop a plot, or it might be by getting us to a point where we can slowly unravel elements of a terrorist organization. And occasionally we get those people to tell us that information in time for us to be able to act on it, and it has a positive impact. So let's say for every, say, 20,000 or so cases of torture, we create enough good that results in the saving of 2,000 lives. Now, if we're going for a positive net happiness, this is disparaging. It's not a good ratio. We're going out and inflicting harm. In all likelihood, we're destroying the lives of 20,000 people in order to save the lives of 2,000. And so, if we're being good utilitarians, we're not going to find this a compelling argument for adopting our torture practice. Now, someone like Dershowitz or anyone really who's more sympathetic to this might go, well, look, where'd you get these numbers? This just sounds like a bunch of cooked up numbers. It's an exaggeration. All right. But this kind of objection actually really brings up a relevant point now. So I've been talking sort of generally about the numbers that you can get, about numbers of people tortured and numbers of actual ticking bomb cases, and trying to get at some facts. Right? But there's really no real hard data out there. So you really should be asking yourself, how do you know that Wallace's numbers are any more of an exaggeration or any less accurate a prediction than any of the more optimistic estimates of torture defenders like Dershowitz? You go through and you read his article, he gives you no factual reasons at all to suppose otherwise. Doesn't list off any examples of well-documented ticking bomb cases. He doesn't show you a correlation between increased use of torture and decreased incidents of terror. He doesn't do anything that would support his argument from a factual perspective. So if you follow Dershowitz in this article, in this argument, you have to really ask yourself, okay, well, am I agreeing to torture people without any real evidence that that practice is going to save anyone? Am I agreeing to destroy people's lives without the slightest shred of real evidence that I'm going to be accomplishing any good? And I certainly would be the last person to say that I've given you a definitive factual case against torture. However, I do think that in comparison to the paucity of actual facts offered up by defenders of torture, I've made a pretty good case, relatively speaking, especially given that there's not a lot of good data. You might say, well, it may be that torture or terrorism rather, just poses such a tremendous risk to people that it justifies using dramatic and even untested or experimental policies. And so the next question we might then ask is, well, how big a risk does terrorism pose to people on average? So we can answer that question fairly well because we can come up with actual numbers of deaths by terrorism and actual numbers of deaths by other things and get a sense of the relative risks. So let's look at the actual number of people who've been killed by terrorists in the entire world. Now I'm going to pick this period between 1995 and 2003. One of the reasons why I pick it is we have clear-cut data on it. Another reason I pick it is because it includes the largest single terrorist attack in United States history, 9/11. So this period of time, 8 years, we've got data from the United States Department of State. And this is data not just for the US, but worldwide. So during those 8 years, worldwide, the United States State Department says that 9,973 people died as a result of terrorism. So when we ponder our torture policy, we want to ask ourselves, well, how does the risk of terrorism compare to other risks? And how do the actions that we're proposing and the resources that we're suggesting to devote to terrorism, how do they relate to the actions and the resources that we devote to other things that pose a greater risk or an equal risk? And that's just a standard risk management technique. That's just looking at what we're doing and how it affects real-world outcome and looking at it in a way that compares across all sorts of different activities and endeavors. So when we want to evaluate then the threat of terrorism, we'll put that 9,973 dead over 8 years worldwide into as much a perspective as we can. So every year in the United States, about 400,000 Americans die as a result of smoking-related illnesses, lung cancer, throat cancer, coronary artery disease, things of that nature. Every year in the United States, 31,224 people, approximately, die of septicemia, the presence of bacteria in their blood. On average, about 3,300 people die of accidental suffocation every year in the United States. About 14,900 people die each year as a result of accidental falls. So less than 1,000 dead each year worldwide, compared to 400,000 in the U.S. alone, 31,000 in the U.S. alone, or even 3,000 in the U.S. alone in a single year. The risk of terrorism doesn't look big in comparison to these other risks. And you may think to yourself, well, sure, those things are deaths, but they don't have the dramatic negative impact on happiness that terrorist acts have, because terrorist acts affect more than just the person and their immediate friends and family. So we could try looking at something else, something that is at least somewhat comparable now. So every year, about 73,505 U.S. citizens suffer from non-fatal firearm injuries. So approximately the same number as the actual number of the most recent year, 2013. And in 2013, about 33,636 people died from firearm injuries. So firearm injuries get reported, especially when they're murders. So they affect more people than just the immediate friends and families. So they might be sort of comparable. And again, that's just in the U.S., and that's just in a single year. So number of deaths from terrorism relative to these other causes, and makes terrorism not look so threatening. And if we look at the sort of bottom line, all right, look, terrorism is despicable. No one's arguing that people who die of terrorism are to be ignored or that it should be taken lightly or anything like that. But as despicable as it is, it's not a significant cause of death in the U.S. or even worldwide. And in fact, the worldwide percentage of people killed by terrorism during this period is something like 0.00017%. So 1/10,000th of a percent. So terrorism isn't the significant threat in the US that accidentally falling down is, or accidental suffocation. And it's literally inconsequential in comparison to smoking or even to firearm related homicide or deaths. But no one's advocated dramatic measures like torture as a means to mitigate any of these ills. So when we think about advocacy of torture to address terrorism from a risk management perspective, then the fear that people felt after 9/11 and during this period, say in 2004, and more importantly, the spending and the policies to address terrorism, they seem irrational. They seem disproportionate to the actual threat. And from a risk management perspective, they just don't make a lot of sense.